We are delighted to welcome you to this event, Learning from Alternative Spatial Practices, featuring our esteemed guests, Nzinga Mboup, Khensani Jurczok-de Klerk, and Sénamé Koffi Agbodjinou. This gathering is an opportunity to expand our architectural lexicon, an urgent need for those of us in that uncertain moment of transition between architectural education and practice. Each of our invited speakers, through their education and professional journey, have forged a very particular path for themselves. As an assemblage of thoughts and action molded into a coherent whole, they have each been extremely inspirational to us in the way they have successfully done so. So we thought we would pick their brain on how exactly they forged their own path.
So we will first let each guest present themselves in their practice, and we welcome then all of you to participate, to have an open conversation or brainstorming around the practical, the ideological, the ethical realities even of setting up a practice. So to begin, Khensani will share with us her world, so to speak. So Khensani, you're a visual storyteller, founder of Maitri Architecture, and you focus on spatial education in Africa through the medium of exhibitions, performance art, collage, writing, and lists. You also are currently writing your PhD at ETH in Zurich, researching the safe spaces that Black women have created since the 1980s for themselves. So,
good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to set that up. Perfect. So firstly, I'd like to extend a lot of gratitude to Aude, Ferial, the AA for this invitation. And it's really going to be a reflection of a few things that we've done at Matriarchy, but also my own practice, my own positioning. And I'm looking forward to hearing about how you have mobilized architecture within your own trajectories. As mentioned, my name is Khensani Jurczok-de Klerk, and I think it's really important for me to start with, it's a very personal photograph. One person in the room will recognize it. It's a photograph of my grandmother and myself. It's actually her 97th birthday today, so it's also a bit of a shout out to her. And this is a picture taken in Utrecht or Utrecht, KwaZulu-Natal, in a rural part of South Africa. We're sitting on a kansi mat outside of a 2-bedroom house, which my grandparents and their 12 children were of course, forcibly moved to during the apartheid regime from the inner town. And I use this picture to introduce myself because, I mean, this is a house that I know from my childhood. It's no longer the house that our grandparents live in. But it's a very important picture to describe the socio-political dimensions that many South Africans carry. It's a very domestic environment, the very pervasive ways in which apartheid makes itself visible to this day. Very multi-scalar, of course, reality. On the left side, you see a diagram from 1948. That's the apartheid spatial plan that very much so shows how infrastructure was used to segregate populations according to race, but also class, and the ways in which that has persisted. When you see at the image on your right, an image from Time magazine 2019, describing how South Africa, at that time, of course, was the most unequal country in the world. So these are the sorts of influences that I think I carried or were very present in during a time when I was educated. I did my initial studies in architecture in South Africa at the University of Cape Town, and then later in the UK, and now I find myself in Switzerland. But I also want to mention that I'm, like all of us here, a product of the places and people that I've encountered. So I'm local. I consider myself local to Johannesburg, a very hustling city, a very energetic, enigmatic city. We can talk about in discussion. Cape Town, a very segregated but also very idyllic city, quite surrealistic if you ask me. And then strangely, Zurich, Switzerland, which of course presents itself with a very consolidated material infrastructure, but very complicated socially. And I'll explain a little bit about that. But I take the time to show you where I speak from rather than from where I come from, because these are all places that are evolving within my imaginary. And what I do in Switzerland is, as Ferial mentioned, I'm doing my PhD at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture, or known as the GTA, the GTA. And there I'm focusing on essentially reconstructing an archive of a project that existed between 1990 and 2010. This is an image from that place. It was called the Treffpunkt Schwarze Frauen, which translates to the meeting place for Black women. It existed between, it was conceptualized in the 1980s, and the unlike many other cultural heritages in Switzerland, the archive of this place is fairly absent in official archives. It exists in the mouths of many. It exists and it lingers in personal photo albums, and so I'm kind of excavating through those mediums as a way of really trying to make that cultural heritage available to many other Black women rooting and homing and finding sort of cultural belonging in Switzerland. I'm not going to explain my PhD to you, but I just thought to mention that because it also informs some of the thinking in matriarchy, and matriarchy also informs a lot of the ways in which I continue to work through this PhD. So matriarchitecture is a very special practice. So we're a group currently of 26 pluridisciplinary spatial practitioners, so ranging from architects to scholars, artists. And we basically, what brings us together is a shared desire to learn through spatial expression, and more so to learn about our entangled realities, histories, imaginaries. And you'll notice that our projects are not fixed in scale or medium, and that's part of the work. Matriarchy in itself is a project, and I'll explain why in a bit. But I'd also like to mention where it comes from, how it was conceptualized. I don't often get the opportunity to do that, so I'm glad that that was prompted by Aude and Ferial. And this is probably very familiar to a lot of us. Matriarchy, I founded in 2017 following a very disgruntled moment, I think, in my own trajectory. The 2015 and 2016 were marked by national student protests across South Africa, calling, rightfully so, for a decolonial and free education. And part of that process entailed rethinking curricula, rethinking also pedagogical frameworks, how we learn, where we learn, how do we love to learn. And, all of the people in matriarchy, we're an intergenerational group, we all shared this discomfort that we knew so much about Western canonical architecture, but we knew not too much about our own context. And it really started from a space of seeking what we could learn about our environment. And so it started as a blog, to be completely honest. And then I very quickly realized that other people were also interested in the same questions I was asking. These are collective questions, and we very quickly formulated a way to work together. Today we work like this. This is a methodological diagram. I'd love to spend more time on it, but we can do that in discussion maybe, but it's both a stamp of how we've worked until this point, but it's also a sort of projection as to how we'd like to continue working. We're set up as an association in Zurich, but we do projects across different geographies because we're all based between different African and European cities. And we set ourselves up as an association in order to test how we build relations. So nobody is living from matriarchy. Of course, we only do commissioned work, but it allows us to uphold the position to always say no to certain works. It's a slow practice. It's about testing. We work on a project basis. And so the group of 26 women that you see up here who continue to take my breath and inspire me, and it's such a fun space, I have to say. We're never really all together at the same time. Well, we will be soon. But we work in clusters, right? So you'll see, some people work on an exhibition project there, and other people are working on a public pavilion there. And I always like to say that the youngest person in matriarchy is born in 99 and the oldest in 68. And that really makes not only for an intergeographical exchange, but also an intergenerational one. So when we work on projects, we're very insistent on setting up contractual agreements about how we co-author, and we work very horizontally in projects. And then, of course, infrastructurally, we keep that very small. There are only two of us involved in the sort of operations of matriarchy. And that's made for a really interesting way of learning from one another. It's slow. And it's also very convivial. We like to use this word when describing the nurturing of matriarchy. We often gather in our atelier in Zurich through a program called Matriarchy Meetups, but we're also online often. And we're really taking the time to use matriarchy as a space for counsel and guidance and fellowship. I mentioned to you that matriarchy started off really sort of as a discourse-based project, and we still continue to do that kind of work by inserting ourselves into conversations with others who are thinking through writing. These are just a few examples of some publications that we've been involved in. But what I'd like to do is very quickly, I hope I'm okay with time, to very quickly share 3 projects with you that we've done as a way of speaking about how we're testing language, how we're testing spatial expression. And again, I have to emphasize that we're not all architects. So we're mobilizing architecture as a tool as much as we're mobilizing art, moving image, design. So the first project I'll take you through, it was called Reflecting Our Global South Side. In 2021, we were commissioned to participate in the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which was at the time inviting contributions to engage with plots of vacant and partially vacant properties owned by the state. On the south side of Chicago. And the artistic director at the time, David Brown, had identified 10,000 plots owned by the state that were sort of left derelict. And we were very excited to think about the south side of Chicago in relation to our south side. And now we're talking about the SADC region, so South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia. And we departed from thinking about the everyday spatial practices that tend to happen in public space. These are pictures from Johannesburg, really, showing how, well, not some of these photos showing, but nonetheless, the everyday spatial practices that talk about how not only social life is sustained, but also economy is often sustained. So we're thinking about the ways in which people gather, the ways in which people service one another, and the ways in which people really tend to one another. Hair braiding practices was one of the shared practices that we found on the south side of Chicago and noticed in our various geographies. And we were given this plot of land that looks like it's not really well attended to, but you can see by the stake truck that it's very much so an activated space. It was a contested site because 2 blocks up from this woodlawn was the development of the Obama Center was just coming up. So there was also a lot of discomfort amongst the public regarding how to activate a space. And so what we did is we collaborated with Open Architecture Chicago, a group that are focusing on programming and public space, particularly for Black and Brown people on the South Side. And we decided to think of a public seating intervention in which we could kind of subvert the very gridded and sort of constricted plan of the South Side of Chicago. It was a very quirky design, of course, and we were insistent to think about it as a space of intrigue. And also within the limitations of a project that would only last 3 months. And so we thought about how we could allow people to engage in large groups, but also if they would like sort of individual moments of introspection. We tried to leave a trace in order to, by painting the ground, in order to, sort of remind the states that this place is very much so populated. It's not as abandoned as it appears. And of course, when we do these short-lived projects, because that's also very common in artistic practice, we try to extend the life of the work, or we see the work as methodological. And that means that, we often have a digital space that accompanies our physical intervention. And so when you arrived at this public seating intervention, you would scan the barcode on that pole and enter a world, an archive that we had developed with Open Architecture Chicago, thinking about these different everyday spatial practices. Because when we all studied architecture, there was no such precedents to turn to, or these architectures were sort of flimsy and fleeting, but they often construct the spatialities of Black life on the South Side of Chicago and also on our respective South Sides. A lot of the projects I'll show you are methodological. I'll move on very quickly to the next project, which was called Building Africa, the State of Things. In 2023, we were commissioned and invited to do a project by the African State Architecture Project down the road at SOAS. And essentially, we were asked, we were a team of 4. You can see that 2 of us are here. Aude was also involved in that project. So it was a wonderful collaboration. And we were invited by the African State Architecture Project to engage with very dense research that they had assembled over the course of years through doctorates, postdoctorates, that looked at a series of buildings across the African continent that have had political significance in the building of their states. And 2 of those buildings were of interest to us because they're in South Africa and we're familiar with them and we wanted to learn more about them. The image on the left is the Union buildings. And that's essentially the seat of the president in South Africa. But it's also particularly charged because it was commissioned to be designed under British rule and was designed by Sir Herbert Baker. And of course has seen different regimes up until today and remains the same as it did when it was built. So people are carrying memories. And we thought it would be interesting to engage in a sort of public dialogue around that building. And then the building that you see on your right is embedded in the city center of Johannesburg. It's a constitutional hill, formerly a prison for anti-apartheid activists. Many atrocious things have happened here, so it's also quite a haunted site. And you see those towers just on the back end, those are part of the constitutional court. So a place of deep injustice is now the place of maintaining justice, all the whilst hosting a cultural precinct. And so we thought, okay, how do we talk about this? Because the archives account for very specific realities, but we'd like to understand what the contemporary state of things is. Some historical images. And so as we read through that information, all of that research, we kept coming across a series of archetypes. But of course, as spatial practitioners, we're also commonly thinking through certain terms, certain perspectives. And so this formed the basis of a set of prompts that you see. These are book covers that really allowed us to ask the public in the form of an artwork what their memories, their imaginations of these two buildings are. And so the artwork comprised of a set of 6 podiums that you would approach, podiums that also sort of signal the silhouette of the South African flag. But the podium is the site of decision-making, right? There's no speech that has happened in South Africa where the president or the decision-maker is not standing behind a very robust podium. And so you're invited to approach that podium and open a book with a set of questions. You're invited to touch the art, to write down your opinion, and then, of course, immerse yourself within an encased world surrounded by a series of collages that try to encapsulate the often intangible components of these buildings and a sculpture that's sat in the middle of that. And for us, it was very interesting to hear some of the responses. Some people born during the apartheid regime would remark how the gardens at the Union buildings were where they first saw the speech of Nelson Mandela as a democratic president. Others described that the Union buildings were their Instagram backdrop, and the material cultures and the political aesthetic, the politics embedded in aesthetics become very interesting for us. This is an ongoing project. We'll be exhibiting it again in Johannesburg later this year. And so for us, again, it's methodological. It's about thinking about archiving contemporary voice. And the last project that I'll share, I'm a bit stressed about the time. The last project that I'll share is a project titled Home Place, a Love Letter. This is a project we were invited to do by the Architecture Museum at the Technical University in Munich, at the Pinakothek der Moderne, which we were very, very excited to do, mainly because we had such a precious team. I always insist on showing who's involved in the work because there's so many of us in matriarchy, and attribution is important. And we essentially, as a team, we departed from a text written by bell hooks, which I really encourage everyone to read. It's titled Home Place, A Site of Resistance. And in Home Place, bell hooks writes, of course, from an African-American political conscious and context. She writes about the home place not being the homeland or, fixed, geolocated, but she writes about something very fragile and tenuous, having a political dimension. And where it's also, a space of humanization, of recovery, but also of resistance. And, as artists and architects, we use this as a prompt to think about the home place not being fixed in scale or state, but something that we take along with us and is premised on convening, on conviviality at times, but also sharing. And so what we did is we responded to this text by thinking about an intervention that would be housed in the foyer of the Pinakothek. For those of you who don't know the Pinakothek, it's a very, the foyer called the Rotunda is a very circular space. Light comes in from the top And this is the only free place in the museum. You know, it's like the Tate, where they have public interventions. You don't have to pay to go there, but there's also no seating in the Pinakothek. And we thought that this was a really interesting place to sort of intervene. And what we did, I'll start in the center of that, is we used the home place as a prompt to engage with a group in Munich called Afro Diaspora 2.0 to speak about cultural geography and to speak about the ways in which they had constructed and are constructing a culture of belonging in Munich. And they very generously shared very vulnerable and very touching and sometimes very affirming stories about how they're doing that, tracing different parts of migration to Munich. And then you see that you're encouraged to sit in this circular formation, which is, very common in also the geographies that we speak from. And then, of course, surrounded by a very sort of fragile curtain that really it pays a nod to the curtain that often separates inside from outside, or sometimes the lounge from the kitchen in many of the contexts that we're familiar with. And we take the curtain very seriously as an archetype, unlike the door, which often imposes. It locks, it conceals, it shuts, it's opaque, it's a barrier. The curtain, on the other hand, of course, allows one to conceal home place or to open home place up, depending on the choice that you're afforded to make. Whoever enters that space will announce themselves because there'll be a sound that you'll hear from the curtain. In other cases, you'll see shadows that of course announce that someone has stepped in. So we find it a very respectful way of demarcating different spaces, and you can see that we really enjoyed ourselves when thinking about the design of that curtain. Because we really asked ourselves, what do you take with you, since the home place is not fixed in place as a geolocation? We often take things with us to construct a sense of belonging. And so we asked ourselves, what do you take to recover? What do you take to celebrate? What do you take to welcome? And we allowed ourselves to abstract these objects into single beads. So the white bead, for example, is a combination of an Afro-comb that, of course, allows us to tend to ourselves. We carry it with us. But also an interpretation of a fufu stompa, which we use to prepare for others. You don't prepare fufu for just yourself. I mean, there's just a sheer amount of energy that goes into that. You're welcoming and eating and convening with others. So we also see this as a research project. We're continuing to think about the ways in which we spatialize our realities and histories. And with that, I think I'd just like to share the ways in which people responded to it. There is a publication that I'm happy to share the link soon. And I think I'm going to end with that. I'm going to end with that image because I think that it really captures the way in which we try to come together. We focus very deeply on gathering. We focus on slow practice, and we also prioritize having fun and learning from one another. And it does come with a lot of challenges, but I think what I appreciate so much is the ways in which we're very transparent with one another. So I'll end there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khensani. I actually really enjoyed the way in which you spoke about your projects as sort of establishing a method or a methodology, especially as you said in response to this sort of critique that you had of your education as lacking in references that were applicable for you. So that's quite nice. You're creating your own references. So thank you.
So now we'll move to Nzinga Mboup. She's the co-founder of Ferial, a Dakar-based studio conducting research and design projects in bioclimatic architecture in Senegal, built on the critique of the cementization of Dakar. This includes conducting workshops with Massoud on site to develop appropriate building techniques. She is also working with the CCA on a series of talk initiatives that center a post-colonial architecture in Africa, and more precisely in Senegal. So yes.
Thank you, Aude and Ferial, for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here, and I'll maybe just introduce the presentation, but just saying that I'm actually quite excited that this sort of prompted us to talk about our not just our practice, but speak a little bit about our journey and how we came about developing our practice. There we go. Here we are. I just earlier, before we started, and just look at the time, when I looked at the introduction that both Ferial and Aude provided, I guess I had a bit of a nervousness about finding a way in which it could encapsulate all the various things that I do. But then, the presentation, I think, aims to just kind of paint a bit of a picture of the various forms that my practice takes. And it's not just Ferial, you'll see all the various initiatives and different iterations and that my practice takes. But most importantly, what I want you to get out of it is really understanding a little bit how both my journey, but also the context has influenced a lot of the work that I do, and also the kind of concerns, but also opportunities that result out of it. It is something that is in flux, always transforming, but even though you'll see various things, and what I hope is that you kind of are able to really distill what it's all trying to respond to. And I think it's, wanting to find a form of practice that makes sense for a particular context. So I'll start with my personal trajectory. I was asked earlier what this magical animal means, and when I was here in the UK a few years back, let's say, there was a group of some architects of African descent that called themselves the Black Unicorns. And I think I immediately understood what that was. I guess for many of us, I think being of African descent and being in architecture means to be very familiar with the lack of representation of architects that sort of look like us, and often occupying spaces, including, you'll see where I studied. Where even though it was on the continent, it wasn't as evident to actually find places that looked like us. So I'll start a little bit with some biography. I was born in Maputo, and so there I explained the Black Unicorn, and in quite the middle of the city center. I'll always go back to this kind of landscape because I've always been committed to wanting to live in cities. And being kind of like drawn to the energy as well that especially capital cities sort of have, particularly those close to the sea. I did my undergrad at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And I think what I took away the most from it. So I didn't really choose University of Pretoria, I must say. I was just living there with my parents. That were diplomats. That was the main reason for being in Pretoria. But I think in a sort of post-apartheid South Africa, what I liked about studying there, even though you can kind of feel a lot of the tension about how to provide a curriculum that kind of helps to build this post-apartheid state. And I always try to subvert any kind of brief that we had in order to give it a context and kind of give it another set of meaning. So the top project, for instance, which was a second-year project, was kind of geared towards finding modular spaces. Like we had to build a space that could fit into a container, so it was like 3 by 3 by 6. And I found that exercise very difficult to do without putting it within a context. So in this particular case, I had chosen Cape Town, which is a township on the periphery of Johannesburg, to find ways to kind of devise a prototype that could make sense, and again, for that particular context. I then went on to work for this practice called 2610 South Architects, which was led at the time by 2 architects, one South African, one Austrian, with his wife. And what I think I took the most away from this practice was the fact that research was very much central to the practice in a way that was very tangible. So they would, and they were very kind of immersed in their context. The name 2610 South speaks about the latitude of Johannesburg, and that, you'll understand later on how that influenced me. But I liked how they were able to sort of move between, presenting, let's say, the research in an exhibition format, but also letting that inform some of the public projects that they were doing, particularly this taxi rank, which I also got to work on. Then while I was in Johannesburg, I was following, and again, I spoke of the Black Unicorn, the sort of efforts and work, that was done at the time by David Adjaye, focusing on the African cities and the fact that there was very little publication on African architecture, and when there was, it tended to center traditional architecture. So finding, work that was centering the city, to me, the African city particularly, and was very groundbreaking, because that was always been kind of my interest and even the reason why I became an architect. But there was never like a way to have, a sort of material resource that kind of spoke about this. And then the classification on climatic zone became quite interesting further down the line. Then I came to London, studied at the University of Westminster. In my final year, the first year was, a bit interesting. The studio, I discovered the unit system, and the theme was attention economy. It kind of left me a little bit lost in the first year. But luckily, in the second year, a South African professor by the name of Lindsay Bremner arrived in the UK, and she opened the studio, so I joined. And it focused on the main theme was Anthropocene. So we were looking at particularly the fracking industry, and studying the US as a kind of like precedent, but also having in the second semester a site in the UK, because at that time, it was 2014, there were some laws voted to actually allow for this to happen. So what I took away from it was, I think, a consideration of geological time, and obviously the effect that human beings have been able to have on the Earth landscape in such a short amount of time that is still considered almost as big as a geological time. I then left Westminster and actually straight like a month after integrated Adjaye Associates, where I was working, as you can see, on very corporate projects, most of them in London, until the last year of the time that I was there, where to the right, I started working on a project in Dakar, actually, which was the headquarters for the World Bank. So that prompted a lot of back and forth to Dakar. And through that, I got to go and meet some manufacturers, because the project was a sort of net zero building that kind of had a mix of passive design strategies, and interest in working with local bricks, and but also using technology. And I think through that, it started, let's say, my journey back to the continent. And I landed on this street on the right, which is Worofila Street. And it is actually the office of an engineer called Doudou Dem, who actually produces this brick. So I got to meet him through the work, that I was doing at AG Associates. But then I arrived, I didn't have a job. I told Doudou, look, do you have a space for me to just come and like work out? Because I can't just stay at home with my parents. So he got me to his offices in this historical neighborhood of Fanok on Rofila Street. And there I met a whole other, cohort of architects that were all interested in actually working with the material. So the first thing we did was actually a competition. Sorry, I didn't share it here, but we didn't have a name. And I think after that competition, because it went so well, we kind of decided to work together. And we chose the name Orofila as a way, and that's why I was talking to you about 26 and South, to also signify the context from where we were born out, but also our commitment to make an architecture that responds to the context. So now the team, we're a team of, it fluctuates with the interns, but between, let's say, 10 and 12 people, coming from various backgrounds. You should, maybe I'll do a little side note. There are no schools, national schools of architecture in Senegal. So many of the people, particularly lead architects, have actually studied abroad, sometimes in France or Belgium, which will inform as well some of the other research projects that I've done. Our practice specializes in bioclimatic architecture. We work on a range of projects from residential to public infrastructure like train stations, office buildings, cultural institutions. We collaborate as well a lot with architects such as Kéré, for instance. This is the project of the Goethe Institute that is building in Dakar, and we're acting as a local architects and helping to oversee construction. What I'm going to do now is kind of go through some of the kind of like more like processes that I go through. And I think as an architect that even though I am Senegalese, I did not study there. Nowadays, most of the architects that kind of established themselves in Senegal did not study there either. And it was very important for me to find ways to understand the context within which I'm operating. So from I think from the moment I actually moved back, I've been involved in a lot of various research projects. This is one of them called Habiter Dakar, which focuses on housing, it tries to understand the evolution of housing in the capital city, and tries to also think about ways in which we can understand it differently in order to propose housing that is a bit more adequate to our social, economic, cultural, and climatic realities. The project was published online, the sort of, findings of it, and now it's undergoing the editing process to actually make a book, which I have to say is self-published. And it's made me have the biggest amount of respect for what do you call it? Publishers, you say, maison d'édition, because it's really not an easy process. And I just mentioned this so that you understand some of the kind of challenges and really insist on forms of practice. It's important for us to be able to have this book so that it kind of lives on. And we wanted it to be bilingual as well, so that it can speak to people in different geographies across even just West Africa. But then, it's not easy, but we're getting there. Another project that was very important, which it started even before the Habiter Dakar one, is something that we call Dakar Morphose. It was really born out of a willingness to actually research architecture and showcase it at the Dakar Biennales. In 2016, during one of my work trips, I met a previous architect that previously had worked at AG Associates, but not when I was there. It was in 2015. And she actually worked on the African Metropolitan book, also based in Dakar. Her name is Carole Diop. And from the moment that we met 6 months before the 2016 Dakar Biennale. And when that Dakar Biennale was, I think, one of the key reasons why I decided to move back, because I felt that, Dakar had a very vibrant scene, a vibrant cultural scene, and it had a ways of also connecting various parts, let's say, of my world and identities in one place. And we were shocked by the lack of anything related to architecture at a Biennale that's sure centered just the art, but also speaks about culture. So for the 2018 Biennale, we didn't know what, but we knew we wanted to do something. And there was an inaugural text by Simone Jamy, which spoke about questions of identity and processes of metamorphosis, which we tried to interrogate from the prism of the city, and realized that it was important for us to really understand Dakar, to kind of go back to the history of the indigenous people of Dakar that still live there and have managed and found a way to transform and adapt, let's say, to the new form of the city, but still keep their kind of social, cultural, and political practices, and have a very unique form of speciality within the city. So this is the map kind of showcasing the original settlement and how they moved. We were very lucky to be able to then do the exhibition in actually one of the original settlements, which because it's kind of marked by the tree. This is in the the city center of Dakar, which is heavily urbanized, but then you have this kind of pockets of what some people will call informality, but what actually happens there is that those places cannot be moved because they still seats, again, of this indigenous communities called the Pinch of the Libu people of Dakar. So it was interesting to obviously spatialize them through models, talk a lot about their culture. And we're quite excited to see. So this is Carol and I. It's my other partner. I have a lot of business/research partners, and I think that research work has also inspired other, let's say, artists to kind of look at the city through various different lenses and really understanding it. Better through understanding the indigenous community. Then we just, speaking a bit about the process of research, a lot of it has to do with kind of getting information from people, because, people are living archives. I know we speak a lot about orality, but you really get a lot of information by just engaging with people. But there also are physical archives, which are, very much under threat. So whenever we're able to access it, it obviously kind of teaches us a lot. And the research has moved slowly away from just focusing on the indigenous community, but thinking a bit more globally about the question of heritage. And we wrote this article in 2 years ago for After All, which is, I think, based in Central St. Martin's here, on the importance of defining and conserving urban and architectural heritage in Dakar. Because before making, as much as we had already been making a lot of exhibitions, and Dakar Morphose became its own research unit, it just wasn't a one-off. Whenever there will be a cultural event in Dakar, we'll do an iteration of it. We still wanted to kind of put it into writing why it actually matters to us to do this work. And we have, different practices, maybe different backgrounds. Carol was born and raised in Dakar and then studied in France. I wasn't. But through that conversation, I think we were able to center various concerns and various also understanding of what we thought was heritage and what mattered in terms of preserving it, what mattered to us. This was also something that at the time when we wrote the article, we were quite concerned about the kind of growing demolition of a lot of listed buildings in the capital, including this building, which was, it's kind of like modernist building from the 70s. And it was not headquarters, Direction of Architecture and Urbanism. So many of the archives on architecture and urbanism were actually there. Now it's been moved into the new city, but the building was, perfectly standing. We got to visit it in 2019, even though it was abandoned, and then it got demolished in order to make way for a 15-story building. And this was like state-owned. When I got to visit it in 2019, I actually realized that the inside, it was really beautiful to see all the various material processes that this modernist building, was using, with this kind of iron balustrade and the, spiral staircase. The outside had this kind of shell concrete. Inside, you had this remnants of ceramics as well used in the wall. And it got demolished without any type of public outcry. So we got invited by this local institution called Raw Material Company to actually be artists in residence. And we centered that question of heritage. We met with various actors. And when we got the chance to respond through an exhibition, we decided that we were going to focus on like a few case studies, very specific case studies in the city. And we chose this building as a way to kind of talk not so much about and not just, sometimes we get criticized as architects of just, loving past things and sometimes even being attached to an architecture of a colonial period, which people respond negatively to it. But for this building, we really wanted to talk about its material processes and find ways to recreate it in a place. So we did that, and we chose to actually do it using the actual material processes. So the facade that was reconstituted actually had the shell concrete, and we documented it through a booklet. The staircase was actually done with local iron workers, and same thing with the ceramics. And the reason why we did this is because as much as the building is gone, I think we want to make a case for why it mattered, and the heritage in it, the value was really all of those materials processes, not only, but I think for us, that's something that we really wanted to highlight. We chose other case studies such as a garden as well, which is not really listed. And this is a garden in our neighborhood of Dakar, neighborhood of Fanok. But it really is at the heart of that neighborhood. And it's not a very necessarily pretty or well-kept garden, but everybody in Dakar has a memory linked to that garden. Some memories you don't even want to know. Like when I tell my dad about this garden, you just see this smile on his face, because in a way, it's not just that it's public space and that it has that tree with all the benefits. It's also often like a place where, it's actually a place of great intimacies. Like you can imagine, we kind of are in a bit of a conservative societies. People go there for days. People go there to read, sometimes even reading the Quran. Like it's the place where you can just be by yourself. Sometimes kids go to play, etc. It really has a big significance. So part of the exhibition focused on this garden. We identified the plants. We recorded as well with a botanist explaining what you can do with those plants, what are the benefits. And what happened, so this was all within a gallery space, right? We made our point. This is why heritage matters. A year later, we walk past the park and then we see a project to renovate the park done by the city. I'm not even going to share the picture because everything was metal, paved on the ground. And they were like, oh, yeah, we're going to start doing this in 6 months. So we had to intervene very quickly, also being very close by because this is our neighborhood with the knowledge that we have, the archives, etc., but also by working with the community that was not consultant for the project to actually do a proposal in a way to, number one, keep the vegetation, but actually make the garden a better place. And I think this was one of those moments where I realized that a lot of the kind of research and kind of positioning that we have is not just something that should remain, let's say, in certain spaces like academia or, galleries. It's actually something that we can leverage to make, a difference in the city. Very quickly, I'll show you, maybe some of the bulk of the work that I'm mostly known for with Borofila and the way in which we experiment with locally sourced materials. And I'll start by actually kind of showcasing you what the general context of Dakar is and cementization that was spoken about in the introduction. This is the peninsula because it's the most western. So Dakar is the most western city on the African continent. It's a peninsula that's called the Peninsula of the Green Cape because of how green it used to be. You can see how, we're very far from that reality. Concrete is now the main material. And one of the things that we've started doing is also identifying all the various kind of sites of extraction of all of these materials that, allow for the concrete. And it's actually interesting to see that many of them are within in proximity to Dakar, particularly the cement factories, which I don't know if this is actually quite clear. They actually follow the limestone geology. We have about 4 now within an hour of Dakar. And obviously then kind of looking at those sites of production, particularly of cement or extraction, and the kind of environmental damages that it can cause from like air pollution to contamination of like aquifers, etc. In addition to then contributing to building environments that are not particularly comfortable in the way that they're being built. And we have many resources to combat it. And I think our knowledge and understanding of a lot of vernacular architecture allows for that to happen. I'm sharing this picture, which is the house of my great-grandmother in Cameroon that I'm actually named after. And the landscape on my mother's side is that one of laterite. That's what you have on the ground. And that's the material that is being built to make bricks to build with. So these are, structures that I've inhabited. Like many Africans, I would say, I think the kind of proximity and at some point having had the opportunity to inhabit an urban structure is not that foreign. So, and when you look at the ones in Senegal, particularly in the south, it differs slightly in terms of building technology, but you still have the same earthen walls here using the cob technique, and that have a sort of understanding of particularly the geography in terms of what materials are available, but the way in which they use to respond to the climate. So kind of using the same methodology, we work with the materials that we find with bio-based materials. This is Tifa. It's a type of water reed that grows in brackish water. And once you dry it, crush it, mix it with, more like either like lime and a slurry of clay, you're able to do these beautiful blocks, which you can sun dry and then use as infill for, floors and roofs, I guess, mostly, because this is a great thermal insulator. And the technology that actually, in this case, replaces the cement blocks is actually fairly low tech, but has a great potential to bring thermal comfort. Then laterite, which is another a soil which is very present in the Dakar region and used mostly for earth construction, is used and is compressed mechanically to make bricks, which is kind of the same technology when you think about it, it's compressed earth as ram earth. This is ram earth wall using the same laterite. And it's become, then that encounter with Elementaire that I told you about from, the AJ days and the IFC project has become now the unit that we use in order to construct, again, walls, openings, architecture in a way that they can be load-bearing. Very interested in using load-bearing structures as well and exploring the potential that, these bricks give us. It would be the same if it was stone, such as making vaults. And the kind of architecture that can, come out of it. Local timber, as much as it's quite rare, can be quite interesting in certain iterations. This was to do openings, which were all custom made in a house which is in a coastal area, so quite sensitive to corrosion, salt corrosion, especially if you use metal. And the opening was a way to kind of provide light, ventilation, security, and also protection from insects by having this net on the outside. And these are all done with local carpenter. This one this is just below the office in Orofila. That's where the carpenter is, and the kind of way in which it also complements, I think, earth is quite interesting and beautiful. We're working as well with weavers. This is weaving as infill for doors on cupboards, because why use timber, something so solid, just to kind of enclose a space. So these are the kind of experimentation that can be done. Working as well with local ceramics, which are not, even though the modernist building kind of showcased it, it's been dying off because the cement factories have been buying off, at some point bought off many of those small ceramic factories, but the one remaining, we still is an artisanal one. There's a big kind of industrial one, but we like to work with it because it's quite interesting how it complements, the raw earth walls, especially when we want floors that are resistant to water. That's, I guess, what the firing process also allows for. And mostly used for paving on the floor. This is was used for a project that we have done in Dakar of a 4.5-story earthen house and passive house as well, showcasing that it's also obviously possible to do this in the inner city. Other activities include exhibitions. This was an exhibition we worked last year with Aude when she was in Dakar. And it was a really important moment because we started sharing, I think, a lot of the work and the methodology and understanding and knowledge on how to really identify various type of soils, understand the difference between fired bricks and raw earth bricks, between compressed and stabilized earth bricks and adobe that are just molded and sun dried. We organized a series of workshops with various people that to really get them to understand again the specificity of the material, and also the way that is really accessible because it's non-toxic. So kids were there, and all of this has led to us actually working on a project that we're very excited about for this year and next, which is called Mboup, and it's a training center in a city just 30 kilometers away, 50 kilometers away from Dakar, called Sibikotan. That was actually the site. It's a place that has various different type of clay-rich soils for which we can, it has both laterite but many other clays with which we can do ceramics, you can do bricks, you can do a variety of building techniques. So we thought it could be a great place to actually implement a building that kind of showcases the various technologies and continue to share the knowledge. The last bit that I will just quickly go through is the bit about research, learning, and building community, which also this here is a part of. Throughout the years, we've been invited in various places to actually share our work, which and other endeavors as well that I've been lucky to be a part of, such as working for the African Futures Institute with an amazing team of researchers. And this was just before the Venice Biennale, and we were doing a sort of index of interesting practitioners of African descent. The next year, I got to join the Building Beyond program, where I met Khensani as well. And we were mentoring, with 4 of us mentoring 12 various African practitioners. You can imagine there was 16 of us in 13 different African countries. And almost all of us based on the continent in the cities that kind of inform our work. That was a very, I was going to say, emboldening experience to be able to be part of the cohort. Got opportunity to produce a film shown at the Venice Biennale on the work of Élémentaire, and working with a filmmaker, and I got to be the producer of that film, so that was very interesting. But finding ways to also do storytelling, not just through materials, but through visuals, was really good. And now I'm embarking on the last kind of iteration of my practice with the collaboration with the CCA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, that has a program called CO, which is in its 4th iteration and 4th city in the world that they've chosen, this time Dakar, and they've appointed me as a curator. And I chose that opportunity to really look at something that I've always wondered. Remember when I was telling you how there are no schools of architecture in Dakar? That has happened since 91. There used to be a national school that opened in 73. Closed in 91. So for the past, let's say, almost 25 years, all architects have been trained abroad and come back, and very little is actually known about, the architecture of that generation, who are lucky to still be with us. And I've, even in the little bit that I was teaching in Senegal, I was very much shocked at the fact that people didn't know Senegalese architects in Dakar and could not even name their buildings, even though they're all around us. So these are quite a few of the pictures of the one on the right. And then, buildings like this, which is opposite the palace, which I always thought was incredible, but some people would have thought that this was, again, of a colonial era and done by, French architects. And I got to realize that it was done by a Senegalese architect that sure had studied in France, but he's now passed away, unfortunately. Both his sons are actually engineers. And it's been really incredible through that project to be able to access the archive and to be able to really understand some of these building methodology, curate public events as well, invite architects. This is the first woman to have graduated from the National School of Architecture to actually share their work and then write articles about it. like the one on the legacy of the School of Architecture, and finding that through the archives, I'm actually seeing a lot of the premise of the work that I'm doing. And many of those architects are still there with the knowledge. They may not practice it anymore, but they're still around us. So it's been really like a moving experience to be able to really uncover all of those things, speak about architects that are actually working in heritage and what are the kind of tools and challenge that they have towards, being able to renovate buildings, which is a very rare form of practice and almost like a militant form of practice. And now one part that I'm very excited about is kind of starting to also have the tools to define what Senegalese, let's say, modernism, and I should put that in air quotes because, should we be even using that term? I don't know, but I've been really uncovering. And those, I promise you, all those buildings were all around us in Dakar. But I think through this program, I got to have, luckily, a new way of kind of seeing the city and understand it. And that's what research has kind of allowed me to do. And ultimately, it's also something that, informs my practice, really enriches it, and really kind of, I think, anchors it into its context. I'm going to end here. This is just an article that I wrote on, and all those various pictures that you see were my sort of toolkit to empower myself as a local architect. And I had broken it, it's available online now, but into, this kind of like photos that speak about, the kind of daily challenge of kind of operating within the constraint and what is in my toolbox locally. This is, the toolbox with locally sourced materials and everything that has to do with research, learning, and building a community. And I'll end here. So I thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I think one thing I want to highlight and I found really interesting is how you expand the definition of what being an architect is. It's like you go against this idea of like the singular genius. You acknowledge the system of production by highlighting collaboration. And it's really interesting that like feedback loop with all of the collaborators and how you can learn more together and uncover all of those things. So that was really inspiring. Thank you. Thank you.
And so our final, is this working? Yeah. Speaker is Sénamé, who will be joining us on Zoom. And so Sénamé is both an anthropologist and an architect and explores the intersection of technology and vernacular traditions through African architecture. His thinking on the neo-vernacular African city has led him to create Labs, which is a tech hub based in Lomé in Togo, which synthesizes low-tech and high-tech and provocatively seeks to civilize smart cities, which I thought was a brilliant way of putting it.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. You hear me?
Yes, we can.
And you have my screen?
Yes. Yes, we do.
Okay, so everything is good. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to share those 15 minutes with you. And of course, very happy to reconnect with Khensani and Nzinga. The idea for me is to bring you back 25 years ago, because I'm old now, to when I was student in architecture, and share with you what was the origin of my practice. Knowing that my practice, my architectural practice, is barely tenth of the time, or tenth of all my commitment, and knowing that the big part of my architectural practice is theoretical. So I would like to share with you what was my illusions, my dreams, my desire as an architectural student. I decided to study first industrial design because I think in a very early age, I experiment this frustration, to not recognize African in the objects which surround me. I was a little bit seeing some catalog of African traditional objects. I don't find the new object, the modern objects who surround me African enough. And I when I was young, I don't have the answer of this situation. So I think I programmed myself to find a solution and to fix that. So I managed to have a visa when I decided for my high studies. I go to Paris to learn industrial design still in this idea to solve this problem. And I learned when I was student in design that an architect can draw a spoon, but a designer cannot draw a building. So I didn't find it fair, and I decided to go in architecture. And my work as architect till today, I think, was very shaped by my situation as an African studying architecture in Europe. And I would like to share with you 3 aspects of my condition as a student, which I think shape my character or my temperament. I don't know if you say temperament in English, as architect. The first aspect of my situation was the fact that I was a very poor student. I was quite homeless, and finishing my studies, I was even living in the school. So I used to sleep in my school, L'École d'Architecture de Paris-La Villette. We were 3 students at this time sleeping in the school. And this particular position, I think, bring me to a sort of radicality because I didn't find myself studying architecture as my fellow students. I was hearing something different when the teachers, and my perspective was different, being a student living in his school. And I can say that I experiment what in France we call la bohème, and this very radical artistic position in a way. And it was the very first thing, I think, who nourished my approach of architecture, bring me to some very marginal way of seeing things, trying to produce alternative way of seeing things, of building, and giving me this freedom of speech. I think students who don't live as we studies have. The second aspect of my condition as a student is the fact that it's connected to the first one, but I saw very quickly that most of my fellow students, my comrades, was son or daughters of architects. So they are programmed to take the office of their parents as soon as they finish their studies. And I discovered that I'm not competitive with those because they have a capital. They have, of course, a symbolical capital because they have this culture I don't have, coming from Africa. But the symbolical capital I can manage to solve it and fill the gap, But this capital in general, which is the fact that they already have an office waiting for them, I don't have the resources to solve it. And if I compete against those comrades, I will find myself working with them as soon as we all get the diploma. So that brings me to try to see what can make the difference for me and that I think led me to more nourish the theoretical aspect of my practice, because it is in a way the possibility to put justice in this situation and create a difference with my comrades. So, and the third aspect of my situation is something all the African students experiment in when they are abroad, because it is the fact that we don't have a very connected with the continent teaching. You know, we don't have course teaching you what is African architecture and even modern African architecture. And me, I come for learn and go back and change things. So I was a lot frustrated to don't have all this in the program. So that led me to beginning to leave the school and come back to Africa. Every time I saw an association or an NGO building social houses in Africa, I take my bag and I leave the school to go and have this experience, because it is the only way for me to close this gap and to solve this problem I face in the program. And those three aspects nourish themselves or nourish each other, because I was every time gone, I was more and more homeless, where to sleep. And being homeless pushed me a lot to have this strong interest to social sciences, and at some point decided to become anthropologist. So yeah, it is as an introduction, these three aspects of my situation I want to share, because I think that explains a lot about my what I can call now my practice, or explain the origin of all I do now. Those are some pictures of one of these escape I make, leaving the school with my backpack and go to Africa, trying to learn to build with my hands. This was in 2004. 2004, sorry, in north of Togo, with Tambema people who have this very interesting architecture, who is, I don't know how to say, classé au patrimoine, who is in the UNESCO list right now. And but even leaving the school, going to have those experiences in Africa didn't really solve my problem, which is how can I develop a sort of concept or something operational who can change the situation, which is that we don't have African object, or we don't have African architectures who take in charge all the needed or all the exigences of the modernity, but staying African in a way. And I don't even myself understand very well what I'm looking for. And at some point, I begin to search if there is other people who ask themselves those questions and who maybe on the play, maybe let something I can take as resources to go deeper in my own process to find an answer. And on my road, I discovered two people who helped me a lot. The first one was Hassan Fati, of course. Hassan Fati is quite the father of the Renaissance of the vernacular, or what me, I try to develop the neo-vernacular approach. Egyptian architects who discovered in 1940 the vault and dome, Nubian way of building, curved arched structure. And Fabrizio Carola, which is an Italian architect who take the the concept of Fatih and make it more radical, very radical human being, Carola. And Carola was my master. I have this chance to work with him, to learn with him, and that nourished also a lot of the radicality I am looking for in building. Carola, by example, was trying to not use any concrete in his building. I think you all know about the vault and dome architecture. I don't have to explain a lot. But even with what I learned with reading Fatih or working or cohabiter, experiments the life of the chantier of Carola, I am still frustrated in what I'm doing. I begin to build like this, making home for people in the diaspora, trying to build their home, their house on the continent. But I find that I am not still African in what I'm doing, because those concepts are very, how can I say that? You are still enslaved in this very quadrangular shape or master plan, and the resources, even the resources Fatih or Carola are given to me. Don't give me all the tool to achieve what I plan to do. And reading Fatih one day, I discovered this world anthropology. I don't even know a lot about anthropology, but I begin to be interested in understand better what this discipline or this domain is, and I find that maybe it is the best way to address what I want to address, because the problem when you are an architect and you try to be an African architect in this sense that you want to develop an African architecture, the issue is what Frantz Fanon called l'écueil du folklore. At some point, you are limited with what they are teaching you in your architectural school, and you take the aspect, you take the form, but architectural school don't give you the resources or the tool to understand what the architecture is supposed to take in charge, because architecture is just the projection in the space of the social structure. And to understand better the social structure and understand the sense of the architecture, you need to have the tool they can give you studying anthropology. So I decided to move again and study anthropology. And by studying anthropology, I find in a way more tools to better understand what is the problem of this need or this desire to be African. And it is not something African students only face. It's something which other people who are interested in African production already experiment. And what I took as an example is everything happening in Europe at 1930, what we call les avant-gardes or the modernity in Europe was a lot inspired by the discovering of African production, and those very young genius as Picasso or other artists or architects in this period who try to fight the academical aspect of the arts in Europe, and the fact that it is very sterile, very dry at this time, and which is and those people which was searching for something who can challenge the academism and bring another possibility to do things differently. Find in the African production a lot of potential for this, but they take only the aspects, and they use those as concept, but only as aesthetical concept. And I understand at some point that the very true revolution to do as architect is to find in which aspects those aesthetic were connected with an ethic, and how you can with the aspects take also all the vision of the world, those type of object like our mask, etc. Try to say, and so I was a lot at this point interested in all those anthropologists, and it was the beginning of something which is now at some point almost finished, which is the critique of the modernity, with some people trying to challenge the very Eurocentric ontology, saying that there is different ontology, and the European one, you can also call the naturalism, is the only one who is built on the separation of the humans with the rest of living. And other societies and all the non-European, non-Occidental societies develop different approach of making civilization without extract the women, the women of the natural world. And those societies develop some resources, some aesthetical resources, to be able to construct civilization who don't create separation with the nature. And you can see it in their production, their material production, their art. But the art is just the materialization or the contract. And if you go through the art, you understand better what is all the complexities they mobilize to be able to build such societies. So I was interested at some point to the cosmogony and try to understand in which way the cosmogony can be placed as alternative to the paradigm of prophet, which is the last reminiscence or the last form the naturalism take in our societies, becoming global and becoming all Western or Occidental societies. And if you can reconnect with the cosmogony, you have the keys to better understand their architecture and not only be focused on the shape or on the form, but make the architecture explode in some way and reveal what is his skeleton and in which aspects or with which subtleties the ethics is articulated in a specific form. I don't have too much time, so I will just conclude with one of the projects all this reflection 20 years ago give birth to, which is the 8th grade. The 8th grade is a tool I developed first trying to see if if the theory of the African cultural unity is true, and if this theory is true, what is the potential of an African architecture, and in what aspect you can talk about an African global architecture, non-depending on the place you are or it's situated. So it is a very big theory developed in 1960, saying that all the African people share the same cultural fundamentals, and the difference we see in the form or in the shape is only dependent from the place the architecture is built, but each architecture is a new reinterpretation of a common DNA, if you want. So my work was to try to find this DNA, still comparing the cosmogony and all the articulation in each specific situated architecture people make between the cosmogony and the finished form as architecture or as art. So I isolate two groups of architecture. One we can call the area of Volta or voltaic region, and one you can call the area of Chad Cameroon region. And to be able to find if there is something shared by all this architecture and try to find what is the rosary of the connection, the mutual influence, the transformation, etc. I begin to do this work using first two specific architecture, one champion in each group, and compare first those one. And I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining the process to do that. But the idea is to compare two first, and by association, try to isolate what is the common or what is the DNA of all this. So the two very first architecture I began with the Tamberma people architecture, because I know it very well. I used to go there and build with them. And the other one was the Musgum architecture in the north of Cameroon, and also the Chad region, which is at this point 20 years ago was disappearing. At this time I was making my research, we only have two examples of Musgum hut or Kaz still there, and so there is a lot of mission of Architects Sans Frontières to go there and try to save this architecture who was disappearing. I just want to share the picture for the beauty of those architecture. And just to conclude, I would like to share with you some of the discovering I made by doing that. One of the first principles I saw in all those architecture called vernacular traditional architecture was the fact that there was all they have all what I call the figure of gestation. You have something connected to accouplement, giving birth in each of those architecture. Another common concept in all the African traditional architecture in this band, Sudano-Sahelian, is the fact that all those architecture are anthropomorph. Each of those architecture have eyes, mouth, arm, etc., etc. And even the relation with the architecture was mediated like a relation with a human being, most of the time with a woman. And the architecture in most of those societies is considered as the elder of the family, but the elder is the woman. So after this work, I find 8 principles which is common to this architecture, and reads and a proposition, knowing that those 8 traditional architecture. So that will help the care of folklorism, but you can make a building using those 8 principles, even if this building not seem African in his aspect. You know that he's taking the ethic of all those traditional architecture I used to make this word, and in the principle of the space, the use of the space, you can be sure that it is an African in a way. So yeah, it is. I think I don't have more time, but it is something I would like to share with you. Something which was an obsession when I was a young student in architecture, and an obsession being in Europe, a little bit isolated, working with a lot of resources, monography, books, etc., and using all this Western association, going to Africa to build social houses with a very specific mentality to try to learn also. Yeah, it is something I think can be interest to share with you, to talk about. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sénamé. There were a bit of a internet connectivity problem at the very end, but we did get most of it. But thank you. That was incredibly interesting, and I think a subtext that I found quite interesting was this idea of provincializing Europe, to quote Fanon, which was so aptly brought up, and sort of reinscribing African architecture into its own continent. So thank you so much for that.
Really quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, but it's just to ask all of you if you have a word to say to the new generation of architects, maybe a sentence or a word. What do you want to tell us? Please. Okay, start.
I have to give what, advice or a word?
Like advice to you younger self, maybe like one sentence. It doesn't need to be that deep, honestly, but
Or to us, because we need it.
I just had the conversation earlier. I would say it's, I think in a lot of the common themes of what we see through our presentation today is that, you know, when you are in an environment that doesn't really give you what you need, I think just go seek it. That's what I would say.
thank you.
Yeah, I can echo that. I think obsession is really inspiring, and I really also read that in this incredibly interesting presentation that Sénamé has shared with us. I think for me, I constantly go back to this, a few lines I write down for myself in the same way that you ask us. And I think one of them is, I can't remember who told me, but probably it came to me in through different mouths, but to really be prepared to live in the line that you draw. And it sounds really daunting and really, because it is, but somehow trying to do one's best when designing some sort of spatial experience. And then the other one is, I think for me also kind of being within an educational environment, so teaching and also at the same time learning, is I had a supervisor who's actually now at the AA, but is not here tonight. The first thing that he said to me, I maybe reveal his name at the end. The first thing that he said to me when he taught me was, if you give me 10%, I'll give you 10%. But if you give me 200%, I'll also come here with 200%. And I think for me, I really read that as reciprocity, you know, like trying to be as reciprocal as possible in the environments that we're in. Because then it sets up a methodology more. And then that's the project for me, I think. So.
And maybe now, Sénamé, if you can give us an advice.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, every situation is different. I don't know which what advice I can give to all this the young architects? Maybe just to say that we are in an area of utopia. We need utopia more than ever. So don't be afraid to explore your own path, because the solution we need today, I don't think they already exist. So don't rely only on what was already developed, and understand that you are supposed, knowing what is the situation of our time, to invent something new. So feel free to bring something very new on the table.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Ferial is going to conclude.
No concluding words. Well, please stick around, and if possible, carry your chairs to the sides of the room, because we have a DJ coming on.
We're having a party.
Yes. So stay with us. And thank you very much for being here. And can I say one more? I don't. Oh, yes. And thank you so much to our speakers for accepting to fly thousands of miles to come and speak to us tonight. So I'm very, very grateful.